Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me this week is not one, but two Conroys.
Hey.
So on my left, we've got Matthias Conroy, who was with us before on the episode of Restoring Catholic Weirdness. Mm-hmm. And joining us for this week's episode is his brother, Ben Conroy.
Delighted to be here.
So I have three people on the podcast for the first time since the first episode,
Right.
which is kind of fitting because this is going to be sort of a bookmark of an end of season 1 of Risking Enchantment. I am going to take a little bit of a summer holiday. But don't worry, Risking Enchantment will be coming back. My plan is to start either the first or second week of September, and I already have plenty of recording lined up for the summer. So recording will be going on throughout the summer, but I was looking at people's schedules and trying to coordinate different times, and the kind of summer nature of this season, it means that everyone's schedules are all over the place, so it was going to be a bit of a nightmare to get something out every second week. So we're going to take a bit of a break. I'm going to stockpile some really great episodes, and then in September we're going to be starting back again with season 2. But for this last episode, I thought it would be fitting to just cover off something that's been occupying my life and the lives of Matthias and
others.
the lives of others, which is the young Pope. So Matthias and Ben are part of my, I know this feels very embarrassing to admit, I call it our Catholic Bible study group, and then I joke that the most Catholic thing about it is that we do not study the Bible. But in our defense, it did start as a Bible study, and then we started watching more things like Bishop Barron series and lots of other lecture series and stuff like that.
And one thing led to another, and now we're watching the young Pope.
Pretty much. We then decided to take a serious left turn in our academic leanings and do something a bit more pop culture for 10 weeks, which I did not expect. The Young Pope was marketed as a mini-series, so I really wasn't expecting 10 episodes, but we have just finished watching all 10 episodes of The Young Pope as a group, and so while it's still fresh in our minds, I thought it would be good to get this podcast out and have a bit of a discussion about what it was like watching it, why we thought it was good, whether it's worth watching, and what it kind of says about Catholics in the media, because it was a really big production. It's got, big names in it, Jude Law, Diane Keating, and I believe I read that the budget was 45 million, which is pretty big. So The Young Pope is one of the really, I'd say, few examples of people taking a very big approach to Catholicism. I was just discussing with Ben and Matthias that I'd love to do an episode in the autumn about priests in general in TV at the moment. There seems to be something of a glut of them. But even still, they're usually sort of parochial stories rather than big budget.
Vatican intrigue.
Yeah. I'm still amazed. The production quality was so good that you did really believe you were in the Vatican, didn't you?
That was, yeah.
When I read...
was just like sort of cinematographically.
Yeah.
I don't know what the correct word is there, but just, yeah, in terms of the actual look of it, I thought that was spectacularly pulled off.
Yeah.
And when I actually read in some of the reviews that the limited amount that was actually shot in the Vatican, because the Vatican, the Holy See, didn't cooperate with filming at all.
Shockingly.
Bafflingly. And they created a sense of place fantastically well. And, quite often when we finish an episode, there'd be something we'd be complaining about, and then someone would say, but that was a beautiful shot, wasn't it?
Yes.
They consistently put beautiful things on the screen.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the strongest part of The Young Pope is just the imagery and the cinematography and also the soundtrack. Yes. But the plot is a lot vaguer, so I think we'll maybe give a little bit of an intro to the plot. Probably won't go into it that much, but that's not just because of spoilers, it's also because the plot is just all over the place and doesn't really follow a lot of narrative thrust, so it's kind of hard to sum up what the
defies
story
description a bit.
Yeah.
That being said, we will probably talk about plot details later on, so if for whatever reason you don't want to be spoiled about any little thing about the Young Pope, then probably watch it first.
Yeah, definitely. Although, I was going to say definitely, maybe don't watch it.
if you don't want, then yeah.
It's not necessarily the kind of show that's going to be ruined by knowing, details about the plot.
Definitely
it's
not.
much more about the how than the what.
Yeah. And so the very first thing that I would say about it is that I think the way that we watched it is probably the best way to watch it, which is to get a group of friends, hopefully ones that kind of know a chunk about their Catholic faith or just about the Catholic Church generally, and to enjoy it as a group. I can't imagine watching this on my own. I think I would just get put off too quickly. But the essential premise of the plot is that a young American cardinal is elected pope. Obviously, young is kind of relative in this term. He's in his 40s. But yes, that would be a very young pope, played by Jude Law. And he is elected on the basis that a lot of the cardinals think he'll be easy to manipulate and helpful for a sort of, I guess, liberal, left-leaning policy within the Vatican. And then he becomes elected, and he is much more, at least the show tries to present him as much more of a kind of traditional, orthodox...
tough as nails.
Yeah, dogmatic kind of figure. And he brings with him a nun who helped raise him. He was raised in an orphanage, so his sort of right-hand man/woman in this case is Sister Mary, played by Diane Keating, and he variously comes up against different cardinals. There's the cardinal who was his mentor, who really thought that he should be the one who should be elected pope, who's played by James Cromwell. Is it the Secretary
of State, right?
Yeah.
Voyello,
who is very kind of machinationing his own form of the Vatican, and is very put out when Jude Law, who plays the Pope, his father Lenny Belardo, and then he becomes Pope Pius XIII.
Yes, and he's not inclined to go along with Cardinal Voyello's schemes.
No. And so it's variously about what he does with his papacy and how he sort of leads the church and the changes that he makes. And that's kind of the premise for the
broad strokes, yeah.
Yeah. So within that sphere, it has what I would consider quite a promising premise. Also, it was very much marketed in a particular way to be very provocative. It was marketed the young Pope, and there's a lot of shots of Jude Law looking very sort of sweaty and handsome or something.
I wouldn't. There were a lot of memes. Really, the title sequence where he walks along beside these classic paintings and then winks into the camera roguishly. You know, it's inspired endless memes.
Yeah. Which I think actually that element of it is something that it does quite well, which is a sort of playfulness, which I actually enjoyed.
Yep.
But it also hints at a more, it's interesting. So in the first episode, we're treated to a couple of dream sequences back to back. And there's a lot of dream sequences and a lot of things that happen in this series that we're not sure whether they're dream sequences or not, or they're kind of left a bit ambiguous. But it opens with a dream sequence where we think it's real, and Pope Pius XIII is elected, and he comes out and he makes a speech, and it's all about how essentially the Catholic Church needs to embrace all of these things that it has traditionally stood against, such as abortion and contraception and things like that. And the crowd gathered in St. Peter's is aghast, and it's this very tense, uneasy moment. And then we find out it's a dream sequence, and it goes into a very different, and at that point we're presented kind of with the more traditional and rigid version of the Pope.
Yeah, because when you see Jude Law as the young Pope, you know, a lot of people when the show was first announced thought he was going to be the kind of Pope that's portrayed in that dream sequence. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of modernizer.
And that's what they did with the ads. They even suggest, and like we said, spoiler alert, he doesn't, but they suggest that maybe he's sleeping with people in the ads. And then I think they did a bit of a bait and switch and a sleight of hand where they kind of drew people in with this potentially very scandalous series and then gave them something quite different and still arguably scandalous, but definitely not the show that they kind of draw you in with.
Right, exactly.
But it was a really interesting experience. I've never experienced a show where I've in turns both punched the air in delight and then shouted angrily at how badly that they were getting back to back frequently throughout
so often
throughout many episodes. And so I think maybe the thing that we should do is talk about some of the pros and cons, and usually every pro is immediately countered with a con, so it'll probably take turns in kind of pros and cons.
Right.
I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
Yeah, I'd say maybe to start with one of the pros, the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano didn't talk about the young Pope for a good long time after it came out. I think the editor said they wanted us to either sort of canonize it or condemn it, and we just want to stay out of the conversation until it all died down a bit. And they said, there's a certain thing about this show, which is that it gets that religion can be a significant force in people's lives, right? It takes that seriously. It takes the idea that a person's relationship with God might be something that matters to them and to the way in which they approach life. And that's actually shockingly rare.
Yeah.
If you think about anything, TV, movies, even most modern novels, this massive part of the human experience, whether you're religious or not, is often just completely and left out and unapologetically left out.
Yeah.
So that's something that is not left out of this show.
Yeah, and any expression of it is very privatized. Like, it's what I feel and I won't impose it on you.
Right,
and
exactly.
that happens both in modern culture and then it's reflected in modern art. Yeah. I think that's totally true. I think that's the thing that appealed to me most when I decided to force this upon the group in our in our Bible study, which is that it takes Catholicism seriously, at least in some respects. That it actually seems intrigued about Catholicism and the Catholic Church as an institution. And the one thing I will say about it is that it doesn't demonize the church. And the kind of interesting thing that it does is literally no one in the series is either a saint or a sinner. Lenny, or Pope Pius XIII, is frequently called a saint, but then we're repeatedly shown like things to the contrary. Not that they're blasphemous or anything, but just that he's not this kind of angelic figure. So he's a saint because he can perform miracles, but he's also a very broken person who feels often very far from God. So there is this kind of tension with it. But absolutely no one is a particularly good or bad guy. Rather they have both extremes within them.
The shades of grey, yeah.
And so it does it similarly with the church, which is it does engage with the fact that the church is dealing with sex abuse scandals, or that it's unpopular for particular stances that it holds. But it doesn't actually just say, and all of that is crazy, and they're all evil, and there's nothing to be esteemed about the church.
Right, absolutely.
So I think that's one of the interesting things, is that particularly because I think in some ways we can be comfortable about doing that when it's a single priest, let's say, like I was saying with these kind of parochial parish stories where it's a single person who is trying to do their best, and we can sort of forgive them almost in terms of like a modern audience for being a Catholic and a Catholic priest. But when it comes to actually showing the church as an institution and showing that even the whole of the institution is both like damaged and flawed, but also admirable and a force for positive things as well.
The article Ben was quoting, actually, I think describes it having a docile admiration for the church, which I think is a very good description of the kind of tack it takes with regards to the actual church in the Vatican.
Yeah.
That said,
here comes the
does this show understand Catholicism at all? And I would say it definitely does understand it at all. It understands it to some extent. And this was one of the things that just kept coming up when we come to the end of an episode of the show. Some things just don't get Catholicism. So some things either, as we've said, just leave it out entirely, treat it as this kind of quaint private matter. You might be a Catholic in the same way as you might like looking at the horoscopes on the weekends when you're browsing through the paper. Or it paints this completely bizarro, just a completely out of touch picture of faith in the church. This show kind of does this weird thing where sometimes it seems to really get it. It seems to really understand this is kind of the force that such and such a thing will play in the life of a Catholic. This is why Catholics care so much about, imagery or liturgy. This is, a vision of the way the Catholics see God, and it'll nail that. And then it'll, in the very next scene, and perhaps the next line of dialogue, say something baffling. That just no Catholic would ever say. So an example of this is in one of the big set pieces of the show, where Pope Pius XIII is finally addressing the cardinals after a big build-up. And it's almost like the centerpiece of the first half of the show. And he gives this big speech, and it's obviously meant to be a kind of a traditionalist manifesto, We need to become more mysterious. We need to recenter our faith on God, less about people, less about meeting people where they're at, more about going and finding God. And it's a particular kind of vision, obviously supposed to be portrayed as this kind of, this traditionalist vision. And with some grandeur and also some regrettable aspects from the showrunner's perspective. But then at a certain point, the Pope says, and this is the end of evangelization. and you just go, no, no traditionalist, no matter how hard-nosed, would ever call for an end to evangelization. And if you'd asked any priest about that one line, you say, would a trad say that? No, they wouldn't. And you just kind of wonder how that stuff got passed.
Yeah, and I think the really frustrating aspect of it is not just that the main character holds positions that might be contrary to church's teaching or might be deliberately provocative or something like that, but because they have to be presented in a way that he's meant to be a traditionalist pope, and so you would expect people who are more traditional to be rooting for him and applauding it. So then you have this constant expectation that he's saying something profound. But if you know anything about your faith, you're just sitting there going, but that's not profound at all. In fact, that's awful.
And even the things that are meant to be evil, even the things that are clearly meant to be, this person's a hidebound traditionalist, again, sometimes it's just the wrong things. Yeah. So it'd be like if you were portraying, say, a fascist character, and they said something like, the workers must control the means of production. It's like, okay, I see that this show is meant to be coding this as evil and bad and repressed and whatever, but it's coding it as just the wrong kind of thing. It's not even believable as an example of this kind of worldview, even if it's meant to be portraying this worldview as bad.
Yeah, that is the most frustrating aspect of watching it, because there is a real sincerity in the way that it actually tries to engage with the Catholic faith. But I was saying to the guys here just before we started, which is that so much of it rings true of this kind of approach that we often have in the sort of discourse these days, which is that people who know nothing about the Catholic faith assume that they know everything about the Catholic faith. So they'll say things like, oh, well, I went to a Catholic school and they said X, or they did this. And you're like, yes, that doesn't mean that the church is that or says that or that you have it right. And so there is this sense that the director really did a huge amount of work to then not do very basic work.
Yes. Right.
That could have been solved if they had a single kind of sincere Catholic on their writing team or on set to go, actually, maybe not that. I think that for me...
Call up James Martin, you know? He's clearly available.
But like anyone. And that's it, because in some ways the frustrating bit is the lack of sincerity, because there's so many very fundamental things about the Catholic faith which it just assumes that nobody holds sincerely. So from a traditionalist pope asking a confessor to break the seal of confession, which just is so egregious that you just kind of have to...
And I think the reason he gives is something like, I'm the Pope, and it's like, it's mixing up this like regard for the office of the papacy with just abject heresy. So it's like, it's taking these things which at first seem very Catholic, but just a Google search, talking to, anybody who knows anything about their faith would just know is just blatantly incorrect.
And to be clear here, the point is not, oh, it's so bad that the Pope, asked someone to break the seal of confessional. If you want to portray a Pope who's going to do something like that, by all means, if that's the story you want to tell that story. It's just the idea that anyone surrounding him, whether the person he's asking or anyone else, would see this as kind of a piece with his alleged traditionalism. It makes you think they don't know what they're talking about. And it makes certain things ring hollow, even as other things really ring true.
Yeah, exactly. There is just a sense of it being muddled. I was going to say that one of the things that it's frustrating, because you say it's one of the things you find most interesting, but then it gets left kind of unexplored in any real kind of way, which is that one of the things he does make in his real speech at the start, and throughout the series he's constantly calling for like the end of sort of half-hearted Catholicism. There's another speech where he says, I want fanatics for God. And some of that is actually really quite moving and interesting, and it shows a pushback from a genuine modern occurrence, which is this nominal Catholicism and cultural Catholicism, which only barely dips their toe into the faith. And so to say that, like, well, maybe we should stop calling that Catholicism is a genuine discussion that kind of should be had. But he has a quote where he specifically talks about people who doubt. And again, like Ben already pointed out, it's so funny because so many of the speeches walk on like a razor line of almost being right and then just being wrong. And so the idea that, because, and as Matthias said, there's almost this thing where you would expect a sort of very staunch traditionalist pope to say that doubting is banned now, which is actually not a thing that happens in the Catholic faith. That exploration of reason and doubt is perfectly within the scope that like Catholicism can cater for. But he says, I have nothing to say to those who have doubts about God. All I can do is remind them of my scorn and their wretchedness.
And I guess in that case, it's probably just using it as a plot device to explore his own themes of doubt and so on, which go out throughout the series.
Yeah, well, that's it, because then for the rest of the series, we're kind of led to explore his own doubt, and it's almost really interesting.
Right, absolutely, right, because that's a great premise, okay? On paper, super traditionalist Pope wins in surprise election. Also, this guy doesn't really believe in God, or has serious doubts. That's an amazing premise. You could do so much with that.
Yeah, while also calling for a more rigid and stringent version of the faith.
Right.
And so there are a couple of scenes where it's so interesting, because he's literally performing miracles and then in the next scene saying something like, I don't believe in God. But the problem with it is not the actual idea or the premise. It's the execution, because they can't seem to really settle on a particular motivation. And there is something to be said for people's motivations coming from many places and being a bit muddled. But when they always just seem to fit whatever scene is presented. So at times he is doubtful through great sadness, but he's also doubtful when it benefits him, when it allows him to be scornful, when it allows him to not have any kind of strings attached to what he's doing. There's this disregard that he has, but it's also like a source of great pain for him. It's tied to the fact that he's an orphan or his parents abandoned him, but it's too many directions at once, and so you don't ever actually get to. And also, for such an important theme, they don't really come back to it at the end.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a classic example of doing something narratively which you should never do, which is explain something more interesting in terms of something less interesting. In that, Sorrentino has this, when he's interviewed about the show, the showrunner, the writer, the creator, he basically says that one of the things it's about is loneliness. He says, which is not the solitude of somebody who doesn't have anybody to chat with in the evening, but a more profound, deeper condition and sense of uneasiness, that in the final analysis you are alone. And that's why those who have that knowledge of this solitude ask themselves the question of God. So, again, interesting stuff there, but the closest the show ever comes to an answer to sort of exploring this whole, doubt and faith theme is really, well, Lenny was abandoned by his parents, and a lot of this stuff is just kind of an expression of his sadness about being an orphan.
Yeah.
Which, considering the seriousness which the show often approaches God questions and the epicness of those questions, to just say it's a kind of a Freudian externalization of, parental abandonment issues is a bit boring.
Yeah,
it's kind of boring. And the times where they kind of tease at actually more interesting things, like the Secretary of State at one point is speaking to another of the cardinals, and he sort of confides in him that he actually believes that Pius XIII's election was a movement of the Holy Spirit, and that despite what it may look like, things are possibly turning up. And we never really get any of that. After that point, he kind of just goes back to his machinations and his sort of, his wheeling and dealing. And it's like, those themes could have really done with a lot more exploring, and they kind of just let them drop.
Yeah, and for a show that's so preoccupied with the church as an institution, like Ben was saying, it then swaps it out for the personal. So I think, for me anyway, the most sort of eye-rolling moment was when he is being set up to be blackmailed. So he's talking to a young woman, and so there are cardinals watching him ready to take photos. And they get onto the topic of why he is, obviously in this context, he is supposedly being led to be in an inappropriate relationship with this woman. And he talks to her about why that won't happen and why priests don't have these relationships. But he essentially says something very personal, which is also, in my opinion, kind of lame. Just that it's so ingenuine in the way that it approaches Catholic faith and Catholic teachings, which is to say, he says, priests are celibate because they're cowards and they're afraid to love. And it's so rude and unfair to say about priests. It's one thing to posit it as his own personal reason, but he makes this speech to her in which he says, generally of all priests, and then within the world of the story, the cardinals who are watching him are so profoundly moved by this supposed truth that they decide not to blackmail him anymore because he must be from God. So there's this whole thing where it's presented as if this is a very profound, true thing. It feels so deeply uncaring, like as if it just doesn't care about what an actual priest who might sincerely hold the belief that celibacy allows him to interact with both his people and God in a more free way.
And I think it's one of these classic examples of it getting the externals but not seeing the inside view. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that there was actually, and I wish I could quote the study exactly, but I think generally priests think other priests are unhappier than they themselves are. So priests are actually quite happy, but they sometimes assume other priests won't be. I guess this show is kind of, it's seeing the external things about, celibacy, poverty, and all the things that have to do with the life of a priest, but just completely misunderstood. Like, there's another line where he talks about, we can't be fathers, so we ourselves are reminded that we're always sons, or something like that. And it's like, no priest would ever say that. It's just kind of faux profound and slightly nonsensical. So it's not seeing the inside view and not really understanding the mentality behind what he said.
And it's one thing to say, as you pointed out, Rachel, that this is a psychological statement about Lenny's own beliefs. This is part of the big messed up packet that is this fascinating character. But it's absurd when the show kind of immediately validates this position and uses it as a sign of this guy's great ultimate understanding. It's an example of something that I think that maybe Sorrentino gets wrong a bit about his own show. Because in another interview he talked about how, Catholics would enjoy this show if they appreciated like a great painting, right? You look at a great painting and you're not checking it for orthodoxy. You're just kind of taking it in and being inspired by it and hopefully raising your mind to God. And that's totally fine, I agree with that. I think this sort of box-ticking exercise of trying to assess Catholic works of art as though they're, pieces of didactic instruction, that leads to bad art, and it's a bad way of doing criticism. But sometimes if you don't get the dogma or the doctrine, if you don't get the underlying truth, you also don't get the art, you also don't get the characters. When you're doing a story that's so much about priests, and a story that on some level seems to get that God could be really, really important to people, that God could matter, in a way that a lot of other stories don't. Once you get that, why can't you make that jump to say, well, might a person just want to devote themselves entirely to God? Might they want to be celibate because they want to just entirely focus their lives on that relationship rather than on the other close and intimate relationships involved in family?
Right.
There's no great imaginative leap required there, but it's a leap that Sorrentino fails to make. He trips in the puddle and drowns. And that shows frustrating mixture, right? For every punch the air moment, there is a throw the TV remote moment.
Yeah, and I think one of the most frustrating parts of this is that the question that is certainly where the start of the story is one of the most interesting ones that I've ever come across, and I would love to see someone really, really delve into it. And in some ways he gets it very right, and it really ties in with everything we're talking about here, which is that Sorrentino, in his beautiful cinematography, particularly in its costumes, in the way that it's filmed, really delves into the material and the lavish elements of Catholicism in a way that actually delights in them and doesn't just condemn them as being sort of overblown or self-indulgent. That really gets the sort of beauty of it. He really also gets the really Catholic thing of the paradox, which is that Pope Pius XIII reinstates a lot of these old forms, such as he demands the return of the papal tiara and he starts wearing the red shoes again, and he's wearing all of these more like brocaded and embellished vestments and things like that. But he also completely retreats from the sphere of media at exactly the same time. So he refuses to be seen in public. He refuses to have his photo taken. He refuses to have his likeness on any product of the Vatican, whether it's he has a big thing about plates or bubble-headed dolls, whatever it is, that he has this move towards mystery. And it's interesting that it's both a retreat but also an expansion of the physicality of it. So there is this beautiful paradox where you're both building up in terms of what the things that you use, but you're also hiding them from view at the same time. And it's one of the most interesting things he does, because he talks about how you lead people into the Catholic faith. And he makes the argument that you don't do it by giving them everything and explaining yourself 1,000 times and by putting yourself completely at the mercy of the media, but rather that you foster something that is some more mysterious and more sacred and more hidden.
And that leads to another thing that a real positive about this show, and that's one of the things that it really gets, right?
Yes.
It really gets, when we were watching these bits, a lot of people were saying, that there's such a thing as overexposure. The best media strategy is not always to level of pure communications. It's not always to make yourself maximally available, to go chasing after people saying, hey, I've got something to say. Sometimes it's better to quietly rest in the knowledge that you have something worthwhile, and to hopefully to attract people with that, to let people be attracted by you rather than by what you believe, by the truths that you hold, rather than kind of desperately trying to lasso them,
And in that way, it's very Christ-like.
Right.
Because Christ just preached, and he didn't even necessarily do a lot of preaching in the places that you might expect preaching to happen. Like, I know he is in the temple, but mainly we hear about him in boats and on shorelines and in towns, and he just lets people come to him rather than sort of making a big show and announcing himself when he is coming.
It's interesting, I think, that one of the relationships that Lenny enjoys the most in the show is with the head of Vatican Media Communications, this lady named Sophia, played by Cécile de France. And they very early on established this kind of rapport because she gets it. She sees he has an eye for communications. He knows how to reach people. It's not the way she would reach people, but she sees he's a smart guy, has a plan, and he kind of sees in her a fellow person who understands about human communication. And it's interesting that throughout the whole series, as everyone else is getting frustrated and plotting revenge against Pope Pius XIII, this Sophia character is kind of always delighted to see him. And it's sort of an interesting harmony between two things that seem very opposed. The sort of the demands of a mass media age and the silence and mystery that Pope Pius is trying to introduce. And one of the things the show kind of maybe subversively suggests is that maybe the latter is actually quite a good way of handling the former, that the way to respond to a media age is not necessarily by trying to imitate it, but you may succeed better by offering a kind of contrast.
Which is certainly something that actually does kind of get on the money as what a traditionalist pope might do. That the sort of the mystery of the ancient liturgical rites, that both in East and West, and how someone who is of a traditional mind might actually, take those principles and use them for the age of mass media rather than sort of the other approaches which have been tried in recent years.
And I think in some ways it also really gets on the money how much confusion is caused by over-explaining. And so I think the thing that leaps to mind at the moment is the sort of the airplane interviews from papal visits that always seem to lead to more confusion and more division and more chatter, like just noise. It's not even proper theological discussion. It's just like, well, he said this, or this was taken out of context, or, this isn't what you think it means. And in some ways, that there's such a volume of content all the time that things might actually be clearer if you explained less.
Yes, yeah. The less you talk, the more impactful every time you do it is, yeah.
But I also think, again, a really subversive and really interestingly subversive thing that he does is with the material aspect of it, because I think we've been told for so long that it is both ugly and gauche and disrespectful for the Catholic Church to be a church of beautiful objects, and that's something that we should shrink away from and be uncomfortable with. And it's something Matthias and I talked about a good bit in the Restoring Catholic Weirdness episode, where we discussed why it's important to set ourselves apart from the world, and just having that conversation about what is due praise and what is right for the Catholic Church. But I think it's interesting that it gets right that despite what people say, they still want to see those things. Like, there's a reason that St. Peter's is full every day. There's a reason that the world wept when Notre Dame was burning.
Right.
That as much as it in principle thinks that these things are bad, it also yearns to have some access to them. And so I thought it was interesting that it was in the article written by Matthew Schmitz in was that the Catholic Herald?
See, the Catholic Herald were First Things.
He compares it to Mad Men, which I think is really interesting because there is that sense of seeing something you're not supposed to see. You're not supposed to see people sitting around smoking and being flippant about things that we would now be very careful about. And there is that ability to say that, like, well, while some of the things might not be right, there is something alluring in it as well. And so the fact that it goes through such lengths, like even when he's not in his regalia, Pope Pius XIII is wearing these like papal tracksuits.
Yeah, the papal tracksuits are great. Monogrammed with the keys,
Yeah, and it's a little bit cheeky. I always think that it's at its best when it's a little bit cheeky, like the opening sequence that we talked about, which is set along the Watchtower. And
along the Watchtower.
Like, it's deliberately funny, and I think one of our favourite scenes, and I think most people who watch it will enjoy it, if they can take a little bit of humour in what they're seeing, is they have a whole scene where Pope Pius XIII is put off meeting the cardinals for absolutely ages, and it's getting ridiculous at this point. But he's waiting for the papal tiara to arrive, and so it has what is essentially a girls' shopping mall sequence where he tries on different shoes and different outfits, and then eventually settles on the most lavish one, set to the tune of "I'm sexy and I know it."
My LMFAO.
It's obviously being very tongue-in-cheek, but to me, I think that is done quite good-naturedly, actually.
It really is, yeah, and that you see that scene out of context, and it could have any valence. It could be that this is Sorrentino taking the Mickey out of the elaborate pomp and finery of the Catholic Church or whatever. But when you actually see it in context, it's cheeky, it's poking fun a little bit, but it's like, this stuff has power,
Yeah.
You do know it, Pope, when it's eventually carried in, you actually are kind of struck by the sort of impressiveness of some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's definitely one of those things when we're listening at pros, definitely one of those things that I think the show does get.
Yeah. And in a way, it does. Again, it sort of like fumbles at the last moment with actually getting this point across, but it's also reflected in the spirituality that I think it really nails, which is there's a priest character who is based in Honduras, and he is actually sleeping with the wife of one of the narco drug lords. And eventually he's being moved away from there, and he's being replaced by another bishop who you see in a scene is giving a much stronger and condemnation and a more orthodox message. And this priest who was sleeping around and doing all of those things was the one being very sort of open and tolerant and nice. But when he is eventually kidnapped by the drug lord, there's a really fascinating quote where the drug lord says to him, "If you had preached in your church against the narcos and refused to give me communion, I would not have felt disrespected. You would simply be doing your job, then I wouldn't have felt obliged to use violence against you. But that's not what you did. That's what the current bishop is doing, and he is right to do so. In fact, no one would dream of laying a finger on him. You, however, have chosen a different path." And so there's this sense that the world actually wants to see the Catholic Church be the Catholic Church. And in some ways that's true. I think there is definitely a big push that wants to see a more, what they might term, modern view of the Catholic Church, which is maybe, in their view, more tolerant or in their view, more open. But at the same time, going back to those like aspirations to see the beautiful hats and the brocaded shoes and the beautiful settings, that there is also an underlying draw to see the more traditional Catholic Church that is more challenging and is more true to itself.
Right, absolutely. And those two impulses kind of are somewhat at war with each other within this series, right? Talking about this again, it's in terms of, what people want or what's most likely to be successful in kind of a mass media age. It's interesting to think about Marshall McLuhan, the theorist of media and communications, who invented a lot of the concepts that we now just take completely for granted in media communications. He's the one who said the medium is the message. So the idea being that when you're conveying a message through a television screen as opposed to a printed page, or a printed page as opposed to a verbal delivery, that it's not just a matter of taking the same content and delivering it through different just mediums that don't really alter its nature, but that the very way in which you communicate it is itself a key part of the message. Now, that might seem obvious in the age of Twitter, where you're talking about, how social media is degrading our discourse, but this guy was talking about it in the 50s and 60s. But what's really interesting about Marshall McLuhan is that he was also a really hardcore Catholic. And he had some really interesting takes on some of these moves away from the beauty and the ceremony and the visual attractiveness. He has this quote from his book, The Medium and the Light, where he says, "The need for participation in groups and social forms always requires some code, whether verbalized or in the form of costume and vestment, as a means of involvement in common action. What the young are obviously telling us is this: we want beards, we want massive costumes and vestments for everybody. We do not want of the simple, plain, individual stuff." So his point was that at a time in which kind of expressiveness and, crazy outfits and, television and the power of images was just becoming more and more powerful because of television, it was exactly the wrong time for the church to move away from its own iconic images. And that's something that, it's maybe not something that immediately strikes you, but when you think about it that way, it makes an awful lot of sense. And again, it's something that the young Pope really really kind of nails for the most part.
Yeah. And like I said, I actually think that's the most interesting thing that it does in the series, is this question about mystery and how do you cultivate mystery. And like Ben said, nobody would say, let's stop evangelizing. But I think there is something to be said for saying, maybe we need to change what we mean by evangelizing. And maybe evangelizing means being this beacon of strong Catholic performative religion that people can look to and identify and say a million miles off, oh, that's a priest and that's a Catholic church and that's what that looks like. And draw people to it, rather than simply just going out to people and trying to meet them where they're at, which is something that Pope Pius XIII in the show does not like at all. At one point he says, I have banned the word compromise.
Yeah, it's interesting. And of course, with these things, there's always a kind of a great Catholic both and. You know, probably different people need different things.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of some, you know, binary opposition between meeting people where they're at and sort of being more mysterious or presenting a more sort of evangelization of attraction rather than evangelization of pursuit. You need both.
Yeah.
But it's hard to look at the modern world today in the church and say that it's hard to say that we couldn't do it more, this more mysterious, more attracting approach.
And the other thing I think it does actually really get right, we were talking about how Lenny is so focused on the fact that he's abandoned by his parents, which, as Ben pointed out, dominates the story in a way that is almost baffling, that it's, for us at least as Catholic viewers, the least interesting part of his psychological makeup, and yet it is so present in the story in a way that just seems overblown even in a kind of dramatic setting. But what he does get right is that, so his parents are very, very explicitly said to be hippies, and they are shown to have sort of neglected their duties and run off, and they, I guess, represent that 60s movement, that baby boomer movement, that the reaction to which, for a lot of young modern Catholics, is a return to the more strict and the more dogmatic and traditional form of Catholicism. And so I think it was quite an observant thing for it to catch up on, which is that as much as, let's say, young people at large are being much more sort of progressive within the Catholic sphere, even if their kind of political leanings are more progressive, often their religious expression will be a lot more traditional. So I think for someone who's actually not coming necessarily from a Catholic point of view, I thought that was quite sharp of Sorrentino to pick up on.
Right. And there's this great line where he talks about orphans, and this is hinting at the idea that he might try and explain something less interesting in terms of something more interesting, as opposed to what mostly happens, which is the reverse, where he says, you know, an old cardinal says to him, "You surprised me, Holy Father, you were young, yet you have such old ideas." And then he says, "You're wrong about that, I'm an orphan, and orphans are never young. But the majority of churchgoers," says the cardinal, "are not orphans." Says who? You really think the only orphans are those without a mother and father? And that sense of orphanedness, that sense of, you know, being abandoned by someone or being abandoned by what matters, or being kind of a byproduct, whether you're a child of divorce or whether you're, you know, someone who's addicted to pornography and nobody cares.
Or just the lack of priests, or that, you know, in our particular culture, if you're looking for a spiritual father, they can be literally hard to find.
Right.
And in that way be in some way orphaned by the Catholic Church by just not having enough resources to cater for the number of people that need them. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think picking up on the feeling of being an orphaned generation is very, very perceptive.
And then we have the final speech.
Yeah, I have to say, the final episode is almost like an episode from another show. The whole show throughout is a very, I think I said many times that I feel like I'm watching a fever dream, because there are so many parts that almost make sense but then don't make sense, and then actually go into a dream sequence, and then bits that you are sure must be a dream sequence but actually aren't, that you kind of get very disorientated. But the final episode is as disorientating, but in a very different way, in that it seems to just completely change gears and go for quite a saccharine and very unearned sentimental end.
Right.
Which is largely centered around the potential canonization of this child saint who, again, because it's an unfortunate position to be in, it reminds me a lot of whenever they make a movie about someone who becomes a famous musician, which means that they have to write music for the movie that as a viewer you have to find catchy enough to believe that that person would be a famous musician, which must be a really tricky thing to do. And in a similar way, especially for someone who's not clearly either, like, I don't want to say, maybe he did know a lot about the Catholic theology and was just disregarding it. But the way that it's muddled definitely feels like it's coming from someone who just didn't know or didn't kind of get what he was talking about. But because there are all these very quote unquote profound speeches, and then as a viewer you're watching them going, but they're not profound at all, in the same way that you might be listening to a presumably famous pop song in a movie going, that's a terrible song.
I find it mystifying that so there's this child saint who kind of gets developed, as Rachel was saying, it gets developed in the last few episodes, called Blessed Juana. But I'm wondering what Pope beatified her, because she just does not seem like a saint at all. Like, there's kind of these moments where, you know, one of the cardinals is sort of telling her calls to the Pope. He drops these quotes from her, which just, no one would ever actually say it was a saint. Like, it's so, like, it just does not ring true whatsoever, and that kind of leads to this epic sort of fail of a speech in the last episode.
They might say it if they were an Instagram inspirational quote post.
Right. So there's
exactly.
at the end where Pope Pius is reading a lot of these quotes from Blessed Juana, and a lot of them are put in the form of questions. You know, like, are we joyful or are we sorrowful? Are we rulers or are we servants? And he just starts listing out all these dichotomies, and I'm kind of thinking, like, are we country or are we Western? You know, like, are we human or are we dancer? You know, I'm not seeing the profundity here, Sorrentino. You know, what does asking all these questions actually mean?
And Ben and Rachel can confirm that as he gave all the responses about what God is not, because that's kind of how the speech comes to its conclusion, he tells all these things that God is not, which are primarily things that God actually is, in fact. I think I suffixed almost every single one of them by just saying, no, that's not right either.
God does not comfort us, you know. God does not soothe us.
He does not listen.
And he does not speak to us. I just kind of like, but don't forget, folks, what he does do is he smiles.
He smiles.
God smiles.
Who can forget that?
Yeah, it's like, I mean...
That's pretty much the end of the series, and you're sitting there going, and like, this is a character who, presumably that's meant to be a character development, so he goes from being very sort of like rigid and unaffable. He's quite distant. In fact, in the first episode, he talks about how he doesn't want to be too familiar with the staff of the Vatican because familiar relationships are unclear and professional relationships are formal relationships are the ones that he should be having. And so, actually, more importantly, in his first speech, I think he storms off saying, I don't know if you deserve me.
Yeah.
And then he ends in the final episode by saying, in heaven I will be able to embrace each of you in turn, which could work as a sort of character arc if that had actually been the character arc, but instead it's more kind of muddled and twisted and convoluted.
And very accelerated towards the end as well.
Thoroughly permeated by heresy.
Thoroughly permeated by heresy. Matthias Conroy's review of the Young Pope. Yeah, it's interesting. And you know, and even still there's good stuff there. There's good little grace notes. Some of his evolution does seem believable, and some of it just seems whack.
Yeah, it just seems all over the place,
Right.
which is a bit frustrating. Ultimately, I mean, like I said, it's hard for me to say that I would actually recommend the series. I certainly would strongly suggest if you are going to watch it, like I said at the start, watch it with people, because I think if I were watching it on my own, I would find it a lot less fun. There is at least something gratifying in being outraged together at something.
Yeah, and it's a good funny show to watch with people as well. It is actually very funny in places. It's devastatingly funny. You know, Pope gets a gift of this kangaroo, and it's not really clear what the relevance of the kangaroo is to the plot, but he exchanges these meaningful glances with the kangaroo, and something dramatic will happen, and the kangaroo just hop through the background.
And occasionally you are actually rooting for Lenny. And I actually think it is more of a strength than it is a weakness, the fact that he is at turns both the villain and the hero. He is very cold and harsh on people, but then at other times he's quite caring, but also sees the church as something worth working towards and not just to sacrifice for his own personal indulgences.
And we have to talk about the Italian Prime Minister.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to say. There is an incredible scene where he puts the Italian Prime Minister in his place, and it is one of the unequivocal moments where you're just like punching the air and whooping.
And we were constantly kind of on tenterhooks, being like, when is he going to drop the bomb of, absolute heterodoxy? But it actually, he stays true. It's the one sort of gleaming light at the end of the tunnel of actually like pure doctrine.
And he's got it's this battle between him and the Italian Prime Minister, who's this kind of Emmanuel Macron type figure of a sort of a young, modernising, liberal Prime Minister who's very smart, right? Mm-hmm. So they don't make this guy a cardboard cutout. And I can imagine a lot of viewers of this show probably took his side in this battle, right? Yeah. But you have this incredible kind of battle of wits between the Pope and the Prime Minister, where the Prime Minister is talking about how, visits to the Vatican have gone down since the new Pope has arrived, and people are actually losing touch with the Church, and I have this huge mandate. And then the Pope's bringing back with just this incredible scenario where he talks about the ways in which he could destroy the Prime Minister's majority if he really wanted to, and you believe him, He actually managed to make it really, really credible. And there's this incredible back and forth where they're talking about their philosophies, their worldviews, who really has more power, who has the upper hand, who's smarter. Mm-hmm. And it's this really cleverly written, tightly done battle of wits, which is just at the high point of the series for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there are definitely high points, but there are also very definitely low points. There was, I think, one of the quotes that we enjoyed. I think all of us, when we decided to do this episode, went and Googled every review of the young Pope ever just to see what other people were saying. It's from the New York Times review, and it says, when the young Pope is bad, it's epically so, laughable, with histrionics and mustache twirling and bombastic set pieces. It's weakest the closer it sticks to the narrative of church intrigue, which I actually don't necessarily agree with, but then he goes on to say, when it's good, well, it's still often pretty bad. But it's also gorgeous and appealingly weird. And I think actually the weirdness of it and the lavishness of it are its two real strengths. And the review goes on to say, it's Tarantino composes shots as if painting religious art, and the young Pope looks awesome in both the vernacular and the spiritual senses. So yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag. But I think the other thing that we can maybe touch on a little bit is just its place in culture. Like, how did this series get made? Because also we're genuinely not sure what the audience for this show was.
Right.
It was like a sort of primetime show with a lot of money behind it and big stars, but was also niche enough in its kind of theological wrangling that I can't imagine many completely secular or loosely religious people would find particularly interesting. In some ways, us as sort of committed Catholics might be the best audience because we're probably the best positioned to understand it, but we're also the best positioned to see all of its flaws and all of the ways that it does not work.
I was thinking that, yeah, because there's something like, you almost would have no one to root for if you didn't at least to some degree agree with some of Lenny's sort of, proposed reforms or returns to tradition. So I think that there's, as you say, there's certain things which we as Catholics are going to punch the air more at the triumphant moments, but also kind of, we're going to see more of the light through the window and see more of the dirt that is therefore in that window and sort of the mistakes that it makes.
I wonder, could more secular viewers or more liberal viewers, which is absolutely not necessarily the same thing, empathize with Voyello? Because,
Perhaps.
Let's look at his arc. Maybe there's something there of this apparent, just corrupt bureaucrat is ultimately still cares about the church, and he kind of wants to move it in a liberal direction, but there's clearly love there's clearly real concern. And his kind of battle with Lenny / being somewhat won over by him could be a kind of an entry point there for people who are not kind of down the line Orthodox Catholics.
Yeah, I would agree with you for the first half of the series, but the second half of the series seems to put Voyello mainly within a sort of conflict where he seems to, it's not explicit, but at least it is implied that he's beginning to develop feelings for Sister Mary.
Right, yeah.
And reciprocated feelings for Sister Mary. So it's, yeah, except that it almost just doesn't go there. Like, it's not that couldn't be an interesting part of a story that people might root for, but in terms of rooting for the church. If the question is this is a sort of a battle for the church,
yes,
it kind of drops the
fizzles,
question of Voyello almost like halfway through.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't know whether that's just because of like, I'm going to say it's in some ways poor storytelling, or is it deliberate? I'm not really sure. We did find ourselves sort of questioning the motives the whole way through and questioning whether that was deliberate or whether that was just misinformed.
Yeah, and it's it can be a sign of a great work of art when you don't know exactly what's going on, or you don't know exactly what's driving characters. So in Brideshead Revisited, the character of Sebastian is so beloved, in part because he's kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
What is driving his angst? What's driving him to carry a teddy bear around all the time? There's loads of different theories. People are sure their theory is right. It feels kind of like a real person.
Yeah.
Sometimes the show seemed like it was getting that kind of ambiguity, but often it just felt like there was no real underlying motivation, that whatever problem of the week was driving a person's character in a certain direction in a sort of a plot device-like way, and that it didn't always feel like there was really a plan.
Yeah.
Which leads to a hell of a roller coaster ride, but at the end, just you're left scratching your head and kind of going, was there much there?
Particularly when you consider it is a mini-series. Like, I often find that happens when you sort of have dramatic creep with series that go on for 10 seasons rather than 10 episodes. But when you have such a confined space to do it, you do kind of expect as a viewer that they are able to have at least a clear narrative arc in that 10 episodes. But yeah, I'm glad we watched it, and I think in some ways it prompted the most interesting discussions we've had as a kind of theological group.
Yeah.
Because I guess in some ways when you're just watching something that is very well informed, all you have to do is agree. Whereas when you're watching something that's a little more slapdash and a little more all over the place, then at the end of it you have to sit there and go, well, why didn't I agree with that? And what is the answer to that? And, and even having debates within the group of like, well, I actually liked what he said there, and no, I thought that was very wrong, or, that there was a sense of like actually hashing stuff out, which was actually beneficial as a kind of Catholic viewer.
And I do feel like Sorrentino would probably be pleased with that.
Yeah.
I think if he knew that this group of Catholic nerds ended up having like big discussions about the nature of our faith because of his weird show, he'd be like, good.
We know that we're going to say a season 2, although I think it's more like a spin-off show. It's going to be called The New Pope. It's very confusing as to what the premise of that show is going to be. So we'll have to come back to it, I think, when it finally gets released.
One thing's for sure, it's not going to get any less weird. Joining the cast for season 2 is none other than Marilyn Manson. Yes.
Oh my God.
So,
I knew John Malkovich was joining. I didn't know Marilyn Manson.
Yeah, 100%.
But we have some returning cast, so there's got to be some threads that have, maybe we picked up again. We'll have to wait and see. But.
Yeah. But I also think it was encouraging to see something in the kind of general culture that did at least make a very genuine go at looking at the Catholic Church and presenting it in an interesting and nuanced way, even when it was a slightly muddled way at the same time.
Yeah. Mad as a box of frogs, but I'm glad I watched it.
That's cool. And so, like I said, hopefully later in the year we'll maybe kind of come back to this topic and look at more examples of Catholicism in the media. The one that sort of springs to my mind at the moment, because it's being talked about a lot, but I have not seen, is Fleabag, written and directed by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and has... Like, I only know the character as the way that it's referred to on Twitter as the sexy priest. So I can't say that has necessarily endeared the series to me, but it might actually be worth taking a look at just to see kind of, like I said, I think it's interesting considering in some ways the young pope was presented as the sexy pope.
Right.
That this idea of Catholicism being a bit alluring in a transgressive way, a bit like what I said about the Mad Men element to it.
No, I'm pretty sure they also did not do their research.
Yeah. What was it that you put?
Put the fiddle back on backwards. Put the cross on the front. Ugh. Any glance at any shot of a chasuble that's designed like that would show you. Put the cross on the back. Anyway.
So, Matthias was not on set for continuity.
No, yeah. And a wedding in a garden. Anyway.
But yeah, so hopefully that was an interesting discussion on a very niche and maybe slightly out of date. I don't know, when did it come out? Was it
2017?
2017. Yeah. We're not too bad, but a discussion on the young pope. I know it was definitely one of those ones that was quite controversial when it came out, and justifiably so, I would say. It is certainly a controversial show.
Yeah, it's like what you said at the start. It's like when you're thinking, do you recommend this show? It's quite hard to come up with an answer. I'd love to talk to someone about it. I'd love if someone had watched the show and I could talk to them about it. But if they said, I have not watched the show, should I? I don't quite know what to say.
I think it would depend on a lot of factors. One of them definitely being, can you spare 10 hours?
Yeah, definitely. I still couldn't get over that it was actually 10 episodes. I was really expecting 6, but we managed to get through that extra 4. But yeah, so I don't know. I guess maybe check out The Young Pope if you're interested.
Definitely maybe check out The Young Pope.
Maybe just catch the highlights on YouTube.
Some of the speeches are well worth looking at least.
Certainly watch, if you're not going to watch the show, watch the Prime Minister scene, because that is quality television.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
And I guess that is it for this summer. All I have left in terms of the bulk of the show is to ask the two guys next to me, what are you enjoying at the moment?
I am enjoying the very final season of Emmy Award-winning TV show Breaking Bad, starring the critically acclaimed actor Bryan Cranston, Aaron Paul, and Giancarlo Esposito.
Is this 2016?
Yeah, I just missed out on it when it came out. I thought it was like, is this going to be too dark? And it's actually this excellently well-constructed kind of almost classical tragedy, and it really is as good as they say. The character writing's brilliant, it's consistently focused and trying to tell the story it's trying to tell, and it's a surprisingly moral show for a show that depicts so much immorality.
That's very cool. Matthias?
Speaking of dark shows from the past, myself and Ben and a couple of the members of our family have been recently rewatching the hit anime TV show Attack on Titan, which is it's really spectacular. Again, like similar to Breaking Bad, it touches on some very fascinating themes while also, having sort of tones of darkness and light and fascinating characters. So it's been really a joy to rewatch that. We're rewatching in preparation for the final season, which is just coming out at the moment. So that's really fantastic. And I've been really loving this beautiful weather we've been having at the moment as well. Just like chilling and finally being done with exams has been really nice.
Yeah, I really feel for all of my friends who are doing exams at the moment. It's not quite as hot as it was last year, but I'm quite pleased about that. And I have an excellent segue from Attack on Titan, which is that my thing that I'm enjoying at the moment was also an anime film. It's called Your Name, and it's one of the few very inventive love stories that I've seen in a while. Very charming and actually, like I said, inventive. It's not a story that I've seen before, even though it's in some ways a very traditional, boy meets girl and they fall in love kind of structure. But I don't really know how much to say about it because the plot of it unfolds in such an unexpected way. But I guess I'll just say that the way that they meet is that their bodies switch when they go to sleep sometimes, and so they wake up in each other's bodies and have to learn to navigate each other's lives.
It takes a premise that, could just easily be just used for sort of absurd comedy and get some absurd comedy out of it, but also like somehow tells this really touching, meaningful, great story. It's not just, I'm not just saying this because I'm a weeb, okay? like believe it, you go, okay, anime and the boy and the girl wake up in each other's bodies, this sounds dodgy as hell. No, it's this really sweet story with some really, beautiful shots, great music, and a just fantastic atmosphere.
Yeah, it's another one with a really great soundtrack. So yeah, that's Your Name.
I need to get on that. I haven't seen it yet.
But yeah, so that actually brings us to a close. Like I said, I am lined up to record some new, what I think are going to be some really great episodes, so I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah, it's actually a little bit sad for me to be taking a break. I really love doing this podcast, so I really hope you'll join me back in September. And I've had some lovely reviews recently, and like I keep saying, like everyone who listens it's such a joy for me. So I'll be praying for you all during the summer and always. And I guess, as always, leave reviews if you want, and tweet and reach out and tell people about the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I'll be talking to you very soon, I'm sure. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. God bless.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.